This is Kim Sputic from 10 Sigma, where we provide tools and resources to help students make a successful transition to adult life. Welcome to episode 136 of Transition Tuesday. Today I'm going to talk about compliance and best practices for transition and designing a transition program that meets both of those aspects. Right now I'm going to switch over to a short slide presentation to share this information. Transition compliance and best practices for on-site, hybrid, and distant learning. Transition Tuesday, episode 136. In this video, we're going to discuss the process to achieve transition compliance and best practices in your program. I'm going to begin by outlining the different pieces of transition compliance versus best practices. Then I'm going to get into the specific pieces of the process. Let's begin by talking about compliant aspects of transition and best practice aspects. Both are equally important when it comes to transition. One of the first things to consider with transition compliance is age-appropriate transition assessments. For these assessments to be considered best practice, the assessments are ongoing in both academic and functional skills. For students to have a successful transition to adult life, they need to be able to identify or update their post-secondary goals, which is really the outcome of their transition program. Best practices would be for the student completes post-secondary goal research and shares with the parent and teacher before their first transition IEP meeting. Or if it's an updated post-secondary goal, they still need to review their post-secondary goals they had for the previous year and make sure they are still on target for that, and that's something that they want to do once they graduate or leave the program. The next piece that is needed for transition compliance is the student needs to be invited to attend the IEP meeting. For best practices, the student would also lead a portion of their IEP meeting. We have talked to several teachers and administrators throughout the country, and this is a piece that is missing in a lot of transition programs. The student comes to their IEP meeting and just sits there and listens, which, as we know, does not help the student make a successful transition to adult life, because other people are planning their life and they need to take as much ownership as possible for their transition to adult life to be successful. Another piece in this component is to invite parents to attend the IEP meeting. That's the compliance piece. But in order for the transition plan to incorporate best practice, parents should be involved early and ongoing in the transition process. The next compliant piece in the transition IEP is to identify the transition services and activities, measurable annual goals, and courses of study. Again, in most cases throughout the country, teachers are identifying these for the student instead of it being a whole IEP team decision. The student, with the help of the IEP team, determines needed transition services, activities, tasks, and classes or courses of study for the IEP year. That would be the best practice. And the last piece that we're going to talk about is that teachers need to report progress on annual goals. In order for this to be the most beneficial and meet best practices, between the IEP meetings, the student needs to complete and report progress on transition services, activities, tasks, and their classes in the IEP. I'm sure you noticed the biggest difference in this graph between compliance and best practice, and that is under the left-hand side, compliance side, the teacher is the one who is taking ownership for the student's transition process and the transition IEP. On the right-hand side, the student is taking ownership and being the leader in their transition process. Before I go further into the components of a compliant and best practices transition program, I want to explain that there are two options presented in this video. The first option, which starts on the next slide, is the option to build a compliant and best practices program on your own, meaning we will provide the structure in this video or roadmap, information, and where to get the resources, but you will need to put it all together. The second option is for teachers or districts who don't have the time or possibly the desire to create their own program and want to get started implementing a compliant and best practices transition program right away. If you want to learn about both options, just continue to watch this video to the end. If you want to only learn about 10 Sigma's tools and how we put together a transition compliance and best practices program, fast forward to about 14 minutes and 10 seconds into this video and continue watching to the end. Now that we have discussed the major components of transition compliance and best practices, let's discuss specifically what is needed to design a program that will meet both these components. And as we know, incorporating both compliance and best practices in your transition program will not only meet the needs of all your students, but will give your students a successful transition to adult life, which should be the only goal of K-12 education. So when you're designing your transition program, you will need assessments that are completed by the student and about the student to identify their functional skill strengths and their functional skill needs. Functional skill needs helps identify areas of skill deficit that the student needs to improve on in order to help them achieve their annual IEP and/or post-secondary goals. Not only will you need the assessments, you will also need to design a form to measure student progress on these functional skill needs. The next thing that you will need to design or find are assessments that are completed by the student to identify their wants and preferences and interests, and then activities that are also completed by the student to explore options for education and training, employment, and independent living. Again, you will need to design forms to be used by the student to track progress and report on these activities and tasks. From this information, then the student is able to use what they have learned in their assessments and activities to write their measurable post-secondary goals. Let's now recap and summarize what is needed to have a transition compliant and best practices program that the student takes ownership in. First, you need functional skill assessments that are completed by the student also, not just the IEP team. I'm not going to talk about academic skill assessments here because we know that schools do plenty of these and we have a lot of information that we can put into the PLEP. The next thing that we need are assessments that are completed by the student to identify their wants, preferences, and interests, and then activities for them to do to explore their options. Both of these components are needed in order for the student to write or assist in writing their post-secondary goals. The information from these assessments and activities are also used to write the student's present level of academic and functional performance and determine their annual goals, transition services, and their courses of study. Then, of course, and this is where most districts have difficulty, a form or forms and checklists need to be developed to measure progress on these functional skills. And it's difficult to measure progress on functional skills unless you have some kind of checklist or rubric. And also another form for the student to use to track their progress on activities and tasks they have completed in order to reach their post-secondary goals. Now that we've talked about transition compliance and best practices and what is needed to design a program, let's discuss where you can find all the information needed to build your program. When we look at this chart, you can see all the components of a transition IEP laid out. Let's go through each one to connect the dots. Starting with transition assessments. Episode 69 has both formal and informal academic and functional age-appropriate transition assessments. If you follow the arrow up and to the right, Episode 11 is a formula for 100% compliance for writing post-secondary goals. Now let's move down the chart to the black arrow going to the right for the PLAF. Episode 70 demonstrates how to take all the data and information gathered and write not only a compliant PLAF, but one that even if the student moves to a new school or district, the staff working with that student would understand exactly where the student is functioning and what their transition needs are. Now let's continue moving to the right and look at the annual IEP goals and objectives, transition services or activities, and courses of study. In episode 49, it explains 2 ways of writing compliant transition annual goals. And episode 55 describes what transition services or activities are. Episode 71 explains how to put it all together, meaning from the PLAF in episode 70, how to determine and write annual goals, transition services, and activities, and choose courses that will help the student reach their post-secondary goals. And you can see that the chart illustrates that every annual goal and objective, transition service or activity, and course of study should always lead back to helping the student achieve their measurable post-secondary goals. Then if you look at the purple arrow pointing to the right, as we discussed, there is a great need to track and monitor the student's progress. Episode 33 focuses on different methods for monitoring progress, and episode 74 is all about using rubrics to assess, monitor, and report progress. 2 major components that school districts are not implementing are parent involvement and students taking ownership. In episode 10, it explains why it is so important and how to involve parents in their child's transition process. And in order for students to take ownership in their transition process, they need to understand their IEP, or at least in general, and lead a portion or all of the transition part of the IEP meeting. If you follow this process, incorporating the key points from each of the episodes we just discussed, and using the bonuses from the episodes, you will have a transition program that is not only compliant, but incorporates critical best practices that will help your students successfully reach their post-secondary goals. For your bonus today, I will be sending you all of the slides that I just presented with links to the episodes so you can develop a compliant and best practices transition program. Remember, all of the links to the videos have bonuses that you will have to go in under the video and enter your information in order to receive that bonus for that video. Now that I've given you all the information and resources needed to design a transition program that is compliant and incorporates best practices, I'm going to go back through the 2 previous slides to explain 10 Sigma's Transition Compliance and Best Practice Program. It is important to reiterate that you can develop your own transition program, but it will take time, not only to design it, but implement and adjust it as you go. The quickest way to help your students is to implement the 10 Sigma Compliance and Best Practices Transition Program that has been researched for over 30 years and proven to help students make a successful transition to adult life. 10 Sigma's program takes a fraction of the time to get started. There's no research involved, no designing lesson plans, and best of all, it can be used on-site, hybrid, and for distant learning. Let's look at the assessments that are completed by the student and about the student to identify functional skill strengths and functional skill needs. This helps, of course, identify areas of skill deficit the student needs to improve in order to help them achieve their IEP and or post-secondary goals. These skills are included in the TRACS assessment surveys. 10 Sigma has assessments for students with mild disabilities, moderate disabilities, autism, and severe disabilities. Behind each skill, there is a rubric. The rubric is then used to measure the student's progress on their functional skill needs. The next piece is the assessments that are completed by the student to identify their wants and preferences and interests, and activities that are completed by the student to explore options for education, training, employment, and independent living. Our STEP program incorporates all of these aspects. It has assessments, activities, tasks, and helps the student take ownership in their transition process by having them present at their IEP meeting, and it also helps involve the parents before the IEP meeting. Included in the STEP program is a form that is used by the student to track and report progress on their activities and tasks. The STEP program focuses on 3 areas: before the IEP meeting, during the IEP meeting, and between or after IEP meetings. So in essence, they are focusing on their transition program all school year. When the TRACS transition assessment surveys and rubrics are used in combination with the STEP program, the student is able to use what they've learned in the assessments and activities to write their measurable post-secondary goals. Now let's look at what specific tools of the 10 Sigma Compliance and Best Practice program are used in the transition IEP and process. For the transition assessments, functional assessments, we have the TRACS assessment surveys. Again, we have these for students with mild, moderate, severe, and autism disabilities. In addition to the functional skills in our TRACS assessment surveys, we have designed 2 new assessments, one for the parent, which is a transition planning inventory, and one for the student, which is also a transition planning inventory. The next piece of writing the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance can be taken out of the TRACS transition survey and the STEP program. The STEP program is also used to write the students' measurable post-secondary goals because they have done activities and tasks and involve the parents in order to help them identify their measurable post-secondary goals in that program. From the TRACS survey assessment and the rubrics, annual goals and objectives can be written for the student because, like I said, all of the assessment survey skills have rubrics behind them. So it's easy to determine if you do an assessment of the skill after you've determined the need in that area, that you can determine the annual goals and objectives for the student. You can also determine, using STEP and the rubrics, the transition services and the activities the student needs to do throughout the year in order to achieve their post-secondary goals. And the courses of study can come from the TRACS assessment survey and STEP. For monitoring and tracking progress, you can use our research-based transition rubrics, which again directly come from the skills that were identified as needs in the functional TRACS assessment surveys. For parent involvement and student-led IEPs, you would use all 3 of 10 Sigma's tools. The TRACS assessment surveys and the rubrics are used to get the whole IEP team involved and everyone understanding exactly what piece of that skill or pieces of that skill the student needs to improve on. And then the STEP program, like I mentioned before, gets the student involved in learning about their options, involving their parents before the IEP meeting, presenting at the IEP meeting, and then tracking and reporting their progress between IEP meetings. Let's talk about the 3 specific tools you get with the 10 Sigma Transition, Compliance, and Best Practices program, and why they are perfect for all learning environments. The TRACS Transition Assessment Surveys are used to assess the student's transition needs and strengths, which are functional needs and strengths. It provides consistency in the program and from year to year. The whole IEP team is involved, including the parents and the student if they're able to take the survey. All of the skills are research-based and comprehensive. You can set up and send out the survey in 5 minutes or less, and they are automatically scored and graphed. All the assessments for each student are stored on our secure server, and you can look at all of the students' past assessments. The next tool is the Transition Skill Rubrics. Like I had mentioned previously, each skill in the transition assessment surveys has a rubric behind them. So you can use the rubrics to specifically assess each of the student's transition needs. For example, if the student has a need in being in control of their emotions, you can use the rubric to determine what pieces of that skill the student needs to work on. Write the annual goal and objectives and use the rubric to track and monitor the progress. They also clarify expectations and enhance communication because everybody knows what that skill means when they're looking at the rubric. Again, you can write measurable annual goals and objectives. You can determine transition services and activities. You can also determine courses of study, and they are reliable to measure, track, and report progress. And the last tool we're going to talk about is the STEP program. The STEP program is used to guide the students to take ownership in their transition process. There are activities to help the student identify their post-secondary goals. There's parent involvement. There's an IEP team presentation form for the students during the IEP meeting. There's a transition task checklist form for the student to report the tasks and activities they have completed. And there is a post-secondary goal progress form. The STEP program tool is available in an editable PDF format. So the student can either enter and save the information, or it can be downloaded and printed so that the student can write out their answers. So this is an overview of the 3 tools in the 10 Sigma Transition, Compliance, and Best Practices program. For a part of your bonus, I will be sending you links so that you can go and take a 14-day assessment survey trial. You can get examples of our transition skill rubrics, which are hard copy examples, but they are online in the TRACS software. And I had forgotten to mention that you can edit the rubrics and also create your own rubrics inside the software. And then the last piece, the student ownership for the STEP program, I will include in the bonuses a link to get an overview of that program. For today's bonus, I'll be sending you a PDF of this video presentation, links to all the Transition Tuesday episodes that I mentioned to help develop your own compliant and best practices transition program if you choose to do that, and links to review all 3 tools of the 10 Sigma Compliance and Best Practices program. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you use this information to create a transition program that is both compliant and meets best practices. Be sure to check your email for the bonus we just sent over. If this is the first time you've ever seen an episode of Transition Tuesday, click the link below to receive the bonus. Be sure to like and share the video and leave a comment or suggestion for a future episode of Transition Tuesday. Have a great week. See you next Tuesday.